Well, good morning, everybody. It's so nice of you to come. We're pleased that you see you all here. My name is Baroness Mary Gowdy, and I will be chairing the meeting this morning. We're going to take questions after all of the speakers, after the end, and we will also have people writing in for questions as well. But I think it's important to listen to the issues this morning and then ask the questions. Otherwise, some people don't get enough time to speak. So I would like to say, too, that some of our colleagues, unfortunately, have been delayed because of the Northern Line, but they'll be slipping in as best they can. So today's event is being hosted by the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Programme, the humanitarian policy group of the Overseas Development Institute for War and Child UK. And as we all know, there is nothing worse for a child who's in a war-torn area when they have all the frights of that, plus missing out on education, which, as we know, every day a child is without any education. It has terrible effects in later life and throughout their lives. And I'm joined by a panel of four great people. Mushin, would you like to say your name properly?
Sure.
That I would.
Masood Mohideen.
Masood Mohideen. So that I won't make a mistake. Maureen
Jockey.
Nicola Jones and Mark Jones. So we've got a great panel, and our friend on the line from Nigeria. Can she hear us? She can hear us. Hi.
Emmanuel Arita.
Say good morning.
Hi.
Say a few
Good
words.
afternoon.
It's great to see you. Great. So she's on the link from Cameroon, so we're all here today. And I think we really want to look at the issue of what it's like in UNICEF. There's an estimated 250 million children live in countries and areas that are affected by armed conflict. I think we also know that never at a time when our parents and grandparents were alive that there has been more displaced people in the world. And it is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think it's up to us to ensure that this issue is out there at every place, because until we help solve this issue, we're not going to have a peaceful world in any way. And this is what's going to cause terrorism and other issues that we haven't necessarily always thought of. Lives of children and adolescents found that around 125 million adolescents between 10 and 19 are living in countries with armed conflict. And we know what that happens, especially on both sexes, in terms of being taken away for terrorism, taken away from human trafficking, taken away for all sorts of other forms of bondage. So it's really important that people think about this and think about trying to stop wars and arms. For children and adolescents living in these settings, the risks they face range from physical and psychological trauma to being in real risk of dying or being caught in crossfire. And we saw only yesterday on the televisions about this little girl in Afghanistan who'd been maimed, in Syria, who'd been maimed badly, and how people didn't want her in school because she didn't look pretty. And this is a terrible, terrible thing to say to a child until you can get something else done. And there she's having to spend part of the days with relations. Adolescent girls highlighted the challenges being doubly disadvantaged by age and gender, and they're in increased risk of sexual violence and gender-based violence, and resulting, again, in trauma, and often lack the resources and support to help them. So I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Emmanuela, where she coordinates the youth project. Emmanuela, you speak. Emmanuela.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Introduce yourself, Emmanuela. It's much better.
Okay, I'm Emmanuel Arita Aten. I work for Search for Common Ground Nigeria. I'm the project coordinator of a project called Nigeria Youth Unite. Nigeria Youth Unite project is aimed at working with children from ages 12 to 15. The aim of this project is to build their capacity in order to work together and to be agents of conflict transformations in their communities, because these children have been so affected by conflict, and there's a need to work with these children to help them understand what conflict trauma is, and then to help them get involved in peace building activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I'd like to ask you two questions, but we'll take one question at a time. Emmanuel, in your experience, what is the impact of conflict on children and youth, and why is it important to address these issues?
Okay. Firstly, the impacts of conflict and youth in children are quite enormous, and children and youth often are the major victims during and after conflict, as they suffer both long-term and short-term effects of conflict. And most of the time, if they are not properly demobilized, they carry out violent behaviors, gotten from this conflict into adulthood. And this brings a continuous circle of conflict and violent behavior. I want to share a bit about a child in one of the communities I'm working with in Jos Plateau State. And this community is a community for is mostly dominated by farmers and herders. And we in Search for Common Ground chose this community to intervene. And then we got talking with some of the people, and then just to portray the fact that this conflict had a huge impact on children. There's this little lad I was told about in the community I was working. He was playing with his siblings and he got upset. They upsetted him and he started crying. So they did all they could to appease him, but this kid couldn't stop crying. So they said, okay, we know what to do to this boy to keep quiet. And they ran outside the home and started shouting, the herders are here, the herders, the Fulani are here, they are here for us. And the little child took off to his heel and ran to the room for shelter. Why? Because he had been hearing of what is happening between the farmers and the herders. He has this perception that the farmers are evil, that the herders are evil. They are killers. They kill people. So he doesn't want to be killed. He took off. He took off to protect himself from being harmed. So just imagine a child grow up with such perception. The cycle of violence should definitely continue. He will grow up with this hatred because he has been told that they kill us, they kill our people, they don't like us, they destroy our farm produce, and then they destroy our source of livelihood. So this child will grow up with this perception unless he is being demobilized. It creates fear among children. It creates trauma, just like you said, emotional trauma. And if this trauma is not transformed, it will be transferred definitely. And then it leads to death, it leads to injury, it leads to disability of children, just like the girl you mentioned, that they say she looks ugly because she was maimed. And then talk about sexual abuse and rape, it leads to that. It leads to low self-esteem and confidence. They will seek for love and acceptance from people using all available means. Drug abuse, child labor, child marriage, sex survival, and then forced displacement. And they will grow up with negative stereotype among children and the youth, which will spread conflict in the future. And then stories of past violence create.
Can I ask
Yeah,
another question?
between.
So you can enlarge on what you're
Yeah,
just saying, is how can children
yeah.
and youths be empowered to become part of the solution? In your view, what are the innovative ways to protect children in armed conflict, as you just started to move into that?
Yeah, it is very important to equip children and youth with these values and skills of engagement in the society, especially those in the conflict zone, because all they know is violence. So they can be empowered through creating an avenue for peace for children and youth to express their opinions and views. It's good to listen to these children because in our context, children and youth are not being taken serious. So it's very, very important to listen to them to enhance their and strengthen their peace building knowledge and skills through trainings, peer group engagement, establishment of just mentors and mentors will help. And also to build trust between children and youth and between the community, the security, and even the government itself. And then to support children and youth who are positively contributing to their communities, to promote international peace exchange visits and programs, to organize or promote trauma healing processes and program for affected persons. And then also the formation of peace club in elementary school, middle school, and then high school will help. And also to programs to help build interpersonal relationship among the children and youth. We're talking about quality education, We also equip them with good communication skills and advocacy, and then access to technology to raise their attention, of the people, and then awareness of on peace building. I think if they're well equipped with those, they'll make a huge impact in the society.
Thank you very much. So we'll have some questions for you a little later. So could we now come on to our second speaker? Hi. Our second speaker comes from the Ashok Youth Venture, who joins us from the United States today. This is an organisation that an NGO, Vital Voices, and various other organisations I know well have worked with very successfully in the United States and in other parts of the world. Perhaps you'd like to say just a few words about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Mohsin Mohideen. I'm the Director of Storytelling Innovation. I'll explain what that is later. And the founder of Me, We, Syria, where we're equipping Syrian refugees with tools for understanding how their brains work, how their brains are affected by trauma, and then running through interpersonal communication skills building exercises to enhance their resiliency assets so that they can reclaim control of the narrative of their lives.
Thank you. So could I ask you two questions as well? Can you tell us about the Ashok Youth Venture? How do you use storytelling as a tool, which I think is a very important tool, to change with children and youth, and particularly those affected by conflict?
Yeah, certainly. So Ashoka's Youth Venture, it's a youth-focused wing of Ashoka. And for those of you that don't know, Ashoka is one of the first organizations that built a global network of social entrepreneurs. Seasoned social entrepreneurs. Some of them actually work directly with at-risk youth, marginalized youth, and in conflict, regions affected by conflict. And I can tell you who those fellows are, incredible people. But we noticed that a lot of the Ashoka fellows, they had experiences in their teenage years where they gave themselves permission or they had some type of space to start questioning why, to start turning challenges into opportunities for solutions. So what we wanted to do at Youth Venture was to enhance more experiences and spaces for young people, not just Ashoka fellows, but young people everywhere, to discover themselves as change makers and to live their lives out loud as change makers. So for over 20 years, we've been running different programs, different methodologies, working with the youth ecosystem, parents, schools, universities, companies, governments, to support a young person to live their lives as change makers. It's not just on a young person to go through these programs. We can workshop young people to death. But what I'm learning is when we work with refugee youth, and I just returned from the camps recently, so I'm a bit passionate about it right now. But when they go back outside and nothing's changed, we're failing. We have to activate the whole ecosystem around a young person, the parent, the school administrator, the university admissions people, to also step into that changemaker space with the young person. Otherwise, we're only working on half the equation.
Can you share some of the insights that you've just started to talk about from your recent travels to Syria and Jordan? And what are some of the emerging results of the Me, We, Syria project, particularly around children and youth's psychological well-being and some of the programming gaps? Can I just add one other question into what you were talking about earlier? Yeah. Is that you were talking about the schools and then further higher education. One of the issues that I worry about is about whether we could do some form of sharing, that when young people are ready to go to university, whether they could go even to another country that they would be accepted, so that they would have a new world to start to learn further skills to bring back when the country's ready, or to take others too. Yeah. So I do get worried that people get into silos in the camps.
Yeah. So I'll try and touch on a couple of those really quickly. With Me, We, Syria, we believe in the process of storytelling, not the product of storytelling. There's a lot of storytelling organizations, people putting cameras in a refugee's hand, and that's cool, but that's not enough. With Me, We, Syria, we're bringing in neuroscience, physiology, psychology into a methodology that promotes youth-led spaces for empathy, youth-led spaces for collaborative storytelling, for creative problem solving. The process of storytelling is a vehicle that carries active listening, that carries empathy, that carries the tools and ingredients for sustainable peace and development. So in working with neuroscientists and clinical psychologists, we've come up with a methodology called Me, We, where we're focusing on the young person's inner resiliency assets through collaborative storytelling exercises, such as doing an autobiography of your brain, or trying to do a story, a hero's journey about your brain and how your brain is affected by change and trauma, we're seeing that they discover their own resiliency assets that has benefits when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support. Effectively with MeWe Syria, by giving them knowledge and making more accessible these concepts of how our brains are, how our brains react to change and are disrupted by change, and how our bodies react to trauma. By giving them this knowledge, they understand that change is possible, for good or for bad. And once they understand this concept that change is possible, they then start to say, okay, I'm not stuck with the brain that I'm born with, to borrow the term from neuroscientist Dr. Amen, right, who studied 80,000 brains, and that was his biggest lesson. We're not stuck with the brains that we're born with. So storytelling, again, we're using it as a vehicle for mental health psychosocial support, peer-to-peer, so that a 15-year-old Syrian refugee is able to provide some type of psychosocial support to his friend or his parent or his sibling. And then we're using storytelling as a vehicle for community building. And we're measuring this through a psychometric scale. So we're measuring for capacities of empathy, measuring for capacities of emotion regulation, executive function, so that we can actually track pre and post intervention what is happening at a behavioral level. Not just an M&E of this many number of kids attended a program, that's great, and we can pat ourselves on the back as NGOs. What is really happening for these youth when they're being workshopped to death? At least let's have some evidence that some of these workshops actually work. The other, I think, really important point is we're not focusing enough on a young person that leaves these workshops and sessions when they go back to their home, when they go back to their school. So one of the things that we're really trying to focus on now is there's a demand from within the refugee communities that I'm privileged to work with to adapt this methodology for parents, so that when a young person in our program has all this discovery, is actually re-traumatizing themselves so that they can approach their bodies and their ideas with curiosity instead of fear. That involves some form of re-traumatization, and they're bravely doing it because they want to overcome what they've been through. But when they go through that and they go back home and that hasn't happened in their home environment or in the school or in the schools that they're trying to get into, then we're failing. We're failing them. It's a dangerous thing to unleash all this hope and help them discover all these resiliency assets. And then the adult world, the youth influencer space around the young person isn't doing it. We're not doing enough. And it's something that's really on my brain right now, is how we can keep innovating and refining it so that we can tackle the whole ecosystem, including university and university admissions, which continues to give more privilege to the traditional algorithm of education of memorize, score, repeat, maybe get a job. That is sufficient, maybe, but it's not everything. To thrive in a world where the only constant is change and disruption, a young person needs to know that the university admissions is also valuing empathy, is also valuing creative collaboration, is also valuing resiliency, right, and how to treat one another. This is the new literacy of the world as we're entering this new industrial revolution that they're talking about, where human skills are going to be more important than the things machines can already do. So we need to start valuing and integrating our systems with this type of framework, I think.
This is something that we've really got to get these messages out there, because these are all the forgotten messages or not thought about messages. And that's why today's meeting and report launching is so important. So if we come on to our third speaker, who's been doing some of this sort of work as well in Jordan. And Maureen comes from, manages UNICEF. Tell us a little more about UNICEF in Jordan. It's better you tell us than me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maureen. So I manage a program in UNICEF, Jordan Country Office, called Makani. Makani is an Arabic word that means my space. So basically what we do is that it's a comprehensive package or an innovative model that we run, which provides a comprehensive service package linking to education, child protection, that is psychosocial, as well as youth empowerment program. The program, currently we reach over 100,000 refugees, as well as all vulnerable. We don't discriminate when it comes to access to our program. It's all vulnerable children, irrespective of their nationalities. But we find that 80% of the beneficiaries of our programs are actually refugees, particularly from Syrian community.
So this is Jordan, of course, linked to Lebanon, which we were talking about earlier. So both countries are very close to each other. So I would really like you to ask you what are the problems that refugee adolescents face, particularly as a result of conflict in different capabilities areas. Example, we've talked about education, but with health and education, which is slightly different. Health in particular, I think it's really important, and the education around health.
I think it's important. I just give you a quick context of the situation of Jordan, of the refugees in Jordan. Jordan is one of the largest, second largest country that hosts the highest number of refugees. Specifically, if I could focus only on the Syrian refugees, we have about 1.3 million refugees, out of which 50% are children, and we are talking of about 655,000 refugees registered with UNHCR. The way they hosted, the context of the Syrian refugees, they are hosted in 3 platforms. So we have only 20% who are hosted in the designated official camps, that is Zaatari and Azraq camp. A majority of them are hosted in the host community, meaning that these refugees are actually renting apartments in the most vulnerable districts, poverty pockets of Jordan. And the most severe and vulnerable set of refugees are actually hosted in makeshift housing facilities, which we call informal tented settlements, ITSs. These are the most vulnerable refugees that you can imagine. They are living in farmhouses, and they are really a mobile community. So basically, the situation they are exposed to, the housing facilities are very weak to be able to cater for some of the harsh conditions weather that we have in Jordan. Many of them are facing health problems, particularly the children, in terms of pneumonia, because we have very extreme harsh conditions when it comes to our winter. Many of them also do not have sanitation facilities, no access to water. As a result, particularly as an adolescent girl, you're faced with a lot of challenges in terms of reproductive health issues, having access to basic sanitation facilities like sanitary pads that you can imagine. In addition to that, many of these who live in the ITSs are also undocumented. So that means they do not have access to basic services. Documentation comes with access to healthcare, access to water and sanitation, access to schools. And even when schools are made available, which the government of Jordan has done a fantastic job to create spaces for all Syrians to have access to education, they are still faced with the burden of paying cost when it comes to transportation, cost coming to stationery for the children. And so it comes at a very high cost to be able to even put the child to school, even when space is made available. So what they do is that a lot of parents resort to negative coping mechanisms. That means child labor is very high. We have so many children, so many parents who would prefer to put particularly the adolescent boys to work as a means of coping with the economic challenges. When it comes to girls specifically, violence is also another challenge in Jordan, where it's accepted as a culture to discipline children. So there's violence in schools, violence in families, violence at home, violence on your way to school, there's bullying. As a result, parents are not comfortable or caregivers to actually release their girls to go to school. So they would prefer, they think it's more safe to actually marry off their girls. So early marriages is also another coping mechanisms that is applied for the girls. But in addition also to access to education, as you know, many Syrians remain out of school, despite the fact that there is some space has been made available by the government of Jordan. This being because the opportunity costs. They are facing a lot of economic challenges. They have lost their livelihoods. And so they would prefer to actually engage their children in these negative coping mechanisms as opposed to putting them to schools. Finally, there is also psychosocial trauma as a result of being refugees, being exposed to a lot of violent situation, violence back from home and also within Jordan in the environment they are living. Many of them are exposed also to discrimination. There's bullying between Jordanians and Syrians. And how do you create that opportunities and platform for social cohesion where Jordanians and Syrians can coexist in a meaningful way? And finally, it's the huge challenge that adolescents are faced, is being given opportunities to have a voice, to contribute, to actually be meaningfully engaged, being given opportunities for advancement, the right skills to be able to actually make the right choices. And if we do not engage these adolescents, Syrians, their chances of them being recruited they become vulnerable to recruitment into violence extremism, or resulting to negative coping mechanisms that can be harmful in the community they are in. So it's very important that we provide them opportunities where they can actually contribute positively to their own life and to also the community.
Yes, child marriage was one of the questions I was going to ask you about, which is seen by some parents as a quick fix, but it's a much worse fix. But it's another issue, as we know, if girls are married off too quickly, it doesn't help anybody. How do you see an integrated program approached? Does that have to come from the countries within, or how do you see that working?
Just as in the context that I've given you and the issues that the refugees are facing, as you can imagine, they are really multi-sectorial issues, and they require an integrated approach in how you address some of these challenges, talking about working with also multi-sectorial sectors and players. So our approach, particularly in Makani, we have looked at working with both leveraging on existing local capacities, that is the local national organization, CBOs, as well as government institutions to run this platform. So Makani in itself, we run over 200 of this platform across the kingdom, distributed in the most poverty pockets in Jordan, and they are delivered in the 3 models that I spoke about. We have Makani in the host, Makani in the camps, and Makani in the ITS settlement. And we work also we leverage on existing local institutions. That means Ministry of Social Development facilities, Ministry of Youth, because it's very important that you integrate these issues into the government systems. We also work with the Islamic centers, because these are the centers that can give us, it's very key. They give us access to the most conservative families and children and adolescents who would not otherwise would not be allowed even to go to school. So we have to work on issues of behavior change and social norms communications, issues of culture. How do you build also issues of giving them the right skills, particularly both the parents in better parenting sessions, addressing their cultural aspects, addressing also some of these families, particularly in the ITS, the families are not, they're illiterate. So why should I prioritize my girls' education if I'm not also educated? So it's very important that we address both the duty bearers, the government institutions and the systems, and linking them also up to referral services, where children do not have access to because Makani does not provide everything. We provide a comprehensive package of services, which includes psychosocial support. We also provide learning support opportunities for children who have been out of school, preparing them so that we can refer them back to school. And once they are also integrated in schools, particularly those ones in the ITS, the chances of dropping are very high. So Makani becomes a space where they can be supported as a retention strategy by supporting them in their homework, giving them access to opportunities for library, innovative way. Then we also have the Youth Employment Program. The Youth Employment Program focuses specifically on building our adolescents with the right skills to communication, critical thinking, skills of how they can help them to transition into positive adults into their future, and hopefully also into be able to get employment and contribute positively on their civic identity and civic engagement in their communities that they work with. So it's very important that you apply an integrated approach, working with different players, both within the government institutions, to build social inclusion, social capital, and social advancement. That is the only way you can build social cohesion with these refugees to be able to actually contribute meaningfully within the countries they are hosted in.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to go on to Mark, who will be our last speaker, and then we'll hear a little bit from Nicola. Mark is a child psychologist, and he is a reader in child and adolescent mental health at King's. Perhaps you'd like to talk a bit more about yourself.
Sure.
It's much better than us talking about you.
I'll be very brief on the introduction, but thank you for having me.
The work you do is really important, like everybody else.
Absolutely, like everybody else. So
It's
indeed,
more technical in some ways.
yeah, I'll try to make it less technical. So I work for King's College London, Centre for Global Mental Health, as well as War Child Holland, which is sister organisation of War Child UK. Lots of colleagues here today. So again, nice to be here.
So I'd like to ask you 2 questions. Can you provide a broad overview of what current research is telling about the impact of armed conflict on children, and what good practices and approaches to protect children in this that you could share? It's very difficult because we know that women bear the brunt of this as well, but people forget that children bear it even more.
Yeah. Thank you. So 2 questions really. So let me start with the first, is the impact, and a lot has been already said. Emmanuel has said it, and other speakers have said it. Maybe I can talk a little bit about research that has been done on children affected by armed conflict. There's been actually, over the last decades, a lot of research looking into the mental health and psychosocial impact of armed conflict. And if you look at all of that research together, we can say that approximately 40% of all children in war-affected countries have high degrees of distress, and that can range from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or anxiety. So very much a very large group of children is impacted. If you're looking at, and just to pick one group out of the highly vulnerable, for example, child soldiers, research has demonstrated that on top of that, between 2 to 6 times as much suffering is actually taking place within the group of child soldiers, and then even more so with girls. So just to highlight kind of some of the size of the problems. It might be good to also share one more thing about what research has shown is that initially there was a lot of focus on kind of the exposure to traumatic events as the main driver to distress. And while that still is the case and it holds, recent research focuses much more on kind of what are these mediating factors that influence children's distress. And this is ongoing stressors that have to do with living in a situation of ongoing violence, and poverty, discrimination or stigmatization, child abuse, neglect. So it's very much a combination. Now, what are we turning? Sorry, I know we're pressed for time, but maybe turning to what
You're answering the 2 questions in one, so
exactly.
That's great.
Turning to what we do on the child protection front. So one innovative approach that War Child is working on is seeing if we can have a community-driven child protection response. So how could you promote existing child protection responses through having, so rather than imposing it from outside, having it be promoting existing structures. So the way we're going about that is by having brief ethnographies done in studies to identify community champions that can then take forward mobilization and action around protecting children from child abuse and neglect within communities.
And does War Child support psycho well-being of children and youth affected by armed conflict as well in different ways, taking them out of the camps or taking them out of their areas to try to see if that sort of support helps?
So, I mean, that the core work is obviously supporting children affected by armed conflict within camps, within communities, within any settings where we work. And maybe a little bit more about how we go about that. So we're at the moment, and this links very nicely to what Maureen has been saying, developing a system of care of how can you integrate a set of intervention into a coherent care system, which then, in our theory of change, links to improving the well-being and the resilience of children. Now, how does that translate into practice? Basically, what we're doing is to try to integrate, exactly like you were also saying, interventions from child protection perspective, a psychosocial mental health, and an education perspective into one system of care, which is basically characterized by having working at different social ecological levels, working at the child level, the family, but also the school and the community at large, but also have it at different levels of a public health framework. So not just preventive, but also making sure that you can cater for those 40% of children that have increased mental health problems, or for the children that are abused and neglected. So we're working together closely, for example, with the WHO to work on an intervention that targets children with severe emotional distress. We're working on an intervention that reduces stigma and discrimination of children in areas where we work. So these are just examples like the community-based child protection I gave before. And like that, we have a set of 9 interventions and a couple of enabling components that together form one approach on how we feel that we can best cater for the needs that children have in the areas where we work. Now, and that's my last point, associated with that, we're saying it's important to have that coherent approach, but also have an agenda, a research agenda attached to that.
You have to have that.
So we are evaluating the effectiveness and the relevance of that, of the care system and the individual components. And then, if we actually reach evidence-based care, to take it one notch further and actually say, how can you deliver such care at scale to really reach impact? So what are some of the standards that we can, and again, evidence-based standards that we can put in place to make sure that this care can be implemented at scale?
Because this is very important, because nothing's without measurement, and we need it for the future, although we hope we won't be in the situation we are now in the future. I'm going to just come on to Nicola, who who's the Principal Research Fellow and Director of the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Programme. And then we're going to take questions both from those people on the webinar and people here. We'll have about half an hour, or a bit longer hopefully, about 3/4 of an hour for questions. And I hope some of you will be tweeting during the questions session, or thinking about some of the things that have been said, and the link for Wi-Fi is on the door and on the screens. So, Nicola.
Great, thank you very much. Well, it's a real honour to have such out-of-the-box thinkers with us today, thinking about these really complex problems on how can we better advance child protection within conflict-affected contexts. And I think what's been really rich about the discussion is to see that there's actually quite a lot of cross-cutting themes, whether you're coming at it from a social entrepreneurship lens, as a UN agency, or as NGOs, either War Child or Search for Common Ground. What I'd like to do is just to highlight 4 key threads that I think were cross-cutting across all the presentations that I hope will then lead us into the discussion. And I'm also going to draw a little bit on the work that, as Mary highlighted, we've been doing as part of the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program. So this is a 9-year research initiative. We're working with 30 partners internationally and looking at what types of program interventions work best to support adolescent girls and boys, including in conflict-affected contexts. So we're working in the Middle East, in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, and Lebanon. So I'll draw on some of those experiences as well. So I think one of the first key points that came out across all of the presentations was really the incredible power of narrative. And I think it was highlighted very eloquently by Mohsin, and how it's really critical in terms of promoting young people's resilience, but also providing a spark for them to act as change makers in their locations. And I think we find this as qualitative researchers, that if you're working with experienced researchers who know the context well, that even the very act of holding a focus group discussion or undertaking a life history with a young person can be a powerful emotional experience. We find repeatedly that young people have so often not been asked about their experience by anyone. Too often it's brokered by adults, but they have very rich insights to tell. So I think just finding that space and that time is critical. And I think the point about its process, not the end product, that's so vital there. I think also it's critical to think through what we can learn from peer-to-peer techniques. So we have just been involved in quite a large-scale research initiative working with an adolescent research team in the Gaza Strip. And they're working with adolescent researchers to research to undertake peer research with adolescents from more marginalized groups was incredibly enriching, not just for the adolescent researchers themselves, but also particularly for homebound adolescent mothers and victims of early marriage. And so these were people that had not been reached by the standard NGO approaches, but it was very insightful in terms of revealing the type of support that such homebound adolescent girls require, and the type of psychosocial support needs they have, and what some of the entry points might be. But I think just as important is that over time we need to think about how do we really assess the legacy effects of those types of interventions. So there's many of these types of initiatives, but do we really know what happens over time if you've been part of such an initiative? And this is something we have started piloting with some retrospective work. So we've been working with Emmanuel's colleagues in Lebanon and working with young people who in the past were part of an empowerment initiative. So Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and vulnerable Lebanese adolescents were part of a year-long program 3 years ago, and we've gone back to discuss with them about what they learned. And whether or not there have been any sustained changes over time. And I think what's been critical from the preliminary findings in that research is, yes, there have been lasting effects at an individual level, but much less sustained change at a community level. And for many of the same reasons that kept coming out, that there has not been enough outreach with parents and with community leaders. We're focused, very much in these initiatives on young people, but if we're really to promote social cohesion, then it has to be a much broader socio-ecological approach that we take. So that's my first point on the power of narrative as a process. I think secondly, one of the other critical themes that emerged was about the importance of tackling the often very short-term lens that's taken to working with young people in conflict-affected contexts. And so I think, what we really need to think through is because there's so little funding for child protection interventions, we need to think about ways to mainstream child protection into better funded sectors and flagship programs. So one of the first things I think we can think about is, because there's a lot of funding going into either cash or in-kind transfers to support vulnerable refugees, is how do we make sure that there are robust linkages and referral mechanisms to protection and psychosocial services that come from these social protection initiatives, and that these referral mechanisms need to be monitored and funded. I think the second one is, obviously there's been a big push around supporting education for all, including young people in conflict-affected contexts. So we need to think much more creatively about how do we leverage school-based platforms as a key entry point, not just for reaching young people, for example, through school counseling or peer-to-peer support, but also in reaching out to parents and leveraging much more the parent, teacher, and student associations that we see. And then the third thing is, even though many of these initiatives start off in the humanitarian sector rather than those working in the more developmental type programming, is to plan for the long term. So rather than just having a 1-year program or a 6-year program focusing on child protection and psychosocial services for young people, to think about funding in advance follow-ups. So reunions, opportunities for re-engagement, actually build that in from the start. And we've seen that come up repeatedly in our research in Gaza and Lebanon as a key critique that young people themselves have flagged. Then I think as part also of tackling the ills of sort of the short-term approaches we so often see in conflict-affected contexts, is really to take the lessons that Mark and Maureen highlighted about not creating parallel structures, but working through existing community platforms. So I think, identifying the community level champions is critical, but also I think the Makani initiative has been very, very bold in its work, and particularly linking, as Maureen said, with this existing network of Islamic centers. So a number of the girls that we've talked to have said they would never had a chance to leave the home. They're not in school, but the very fact that the Makanis are being housed within the Islamic centers, which hold some sort of social legitimacy for more conservative populations, has really been a lifeline for these girls in a way that I think requires documenting over the long term, but also scaling up in other contexts. Then the third key point that I think doesn't get enough press, but also again came out, is really this point that Emmanuel made about investing in emotional intelligence. So how can we provide the skills for young people to develop that in very, very challenging contexts of trauma and ongoing uncertainty, particularly because of the refugee populations we're looking at. And one of the things that's really struck me, again, from having done some piloting work with young people working in the Makani initiative, is the number of young boys who emphasized that the thing that they valued most was the communication skills they'd learned from the Makani initiative and learning how to listen. And they talked about the ways in which that had really helped them deal with the ongoing conflict and sort of fractious relationships they had in the community, but also in school systems. And that was very powerful to have 14, 15, 16-year-old adolescents saying it was being taught how to listen and how to communicate. That was so powerful. And that's something that's really struck a chord with me. So then my final point would be, what can we do in terms of building lessons about how do we build back better? So I think one of the things that we hear a lot is, child marriage or child labor. They were already part and parcel of the Syrian experience of many young adolescents, and particularly the vulnerable adolescents that are now in Jordan and Lebanon. Many came from very impoverished rural communities, and this is not something that's particularly new. It might be manifesting in new forms, but child marriage and child labor were relatively common. But I think what we need to see is that the disruption of conflict and that conflict can be an opportunity to shift harmful discriminatory norms and advance a more child and adolescent-friendly approach. So this doesn't have to be just accepted as this is the way it is, but perhaps we can think about how do we take advantage of this context of so much change to try and tackle these kinds of vulnerabilities in a more powerful way. So for the speakers, what I would love to hear more about as we move into the discussion is in thinking about building back better, what indicators do you think from your work will make a difference in measuring and demonstrating progress over time? So in Mark's words, what would some of these evidence-informed standards of care look like for young people in these contexts? Secondly, what are the priority evidence gaps that you as implementers need to be plugged in order for program implementation to be strengthened and support some of the child protection deficits that you've all shared with us? And particularly in terms of thinking about those who are hardest to reach, whether it's adolescent girls, whether it's the young people in the ITSs in Jordan, or maybe adolescents also living with a disability. And then finally, what are the mechanisms or platforms that you're aware of where you think lessons can be shared more globally, but in a very timely fashion, so we can be iterating as we're implementing innovative program initiatives? And if these platforms are not in existence, what more can we do? What would success look like in terms of effective lesson learning?
I'd just add one other point to that before I throw it, is that I think one of the things that gets forgotten, and as many of you know, I'm very involved in getting enough women at the peace table. And I think when the peace is being organised and the funds coming in, we need to ensure that there is funding for the long term, using your phrase, from 5 to 15 years, because these are the issues that get forgotten, like getting the peacekeepers out of the schools and having the schools open. But also we need much better medical facilities and facilities like this as well, which are medical, but they're in a different way and shouldn't be bundled up together. So I'd like to throw the discussion out to questions. Take 4 questions at a time and aim them to whoever you'd like to answer them. Then we'll have 5 minutes for replies. On the second round, I'll take the questions that have come in online, if everybody's in agreement with that. And whoever's going to ask questions, can you give your name and where you come from, please? So who'd like to ask the first question?